As the world centers its attention on the ongoing atrocities in the Middle East, watches the deliberations of world leaders at the UN Security Council on what to do about it, lessons are being learned about how decisions that affect peace and security are made, how power and politics collide with self-interest. There are also questions being asked about the rationality and relevance of the decision-making of the Security Council. And while calls for reforms are not new, they do seem to be gaining volume as the conflict in Israel and Gaza escalates. Let's discuss this now with UP Center for the Advancement of Scholarships Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Good evening to you, Prof. Adebajo, and thank you very much for responding to the invitation to help us understand
this. Good evening.
Perhaps in an unusual beginning, to ask you what questions you're raising, not only as you view the events and the engagements at the UNSC over the last few days or since the conflict began, but maybe even further beyond that.
Well, what is astonishing for me is how this seems like Groundhog Day. You know, some of the language that is being used is almost reminiscent. Some of us are old enough to remember the aftermath of 9/11, when America was attacked. 3,000 American citizens were tragically killed. And the administration of George W. Bush launched 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that lasted over 2 decades, cost the UN an estimated $4 trillion. And the kind of talk that was going on at the time was, you're either against us, you're either with us, or you're with the terrorists. You can't have nuanced analysis and kind of have sympathy for victims on both sides, Israel and Palestine. And that's what is so astonishing for me, that history keeps repeating itself. They say first as tragedy and then as farce, but I think both times it's as tragedy. So, you know, the language that is being used at the moment, the intolerance, the lack of recognition of the 56-year occupation. I mean, what the UN Secretary General said yesterday basically reflected facts. The occupation, the displacement of Palestinians, the extension of settlements that are illegal. That is what has gone on for the last half a century. So him saying that what has happened did not happen in a vacuum is not totally surprising at all.
All right, and we saw, of course, and when you were talking about, the rhetoric that was reminiscent after 9/11, you're then talking directly to what Eli Cohen, the Israeli foreign minister, was submitting to the UNSC yesterday, saying, well, basically, it might be us today, but it could be the rest of the world tomorrow. I want to come then to really the sharp point of this, Professor Adebayo. You have the Security Council, and again, if we go back to its foundational message, it is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. Missed opportunity in the aftermath of 9/11. Here we are at another moment of global pain and tragedy, which threatens to engulf the region in a regional conflict and war. As you look at the way the debates, either around the adoption of resolutions or, again, the veto power of the 5 permanent members, has the UNSC, or let's just talk specifically about the UNSC, outlived its form and function right now?
I think we have to look at how the UN Security Council was founded. It was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I don't think you would have had a United Nations established if you hadn't had the veto. I don't think Russia and its leader Stalin would have accepted to go into the UN without a veto, because of course at that time the General Assembly and most of the members of the United Nations in 1945 from Europe, from Latin America, etc., were more US supporters. And so Russia really felt that it needed the veto to be able to defend its interests. And so we must not have unrealistic debates where we say we should get rid of the veto, because the veto was created within a specific context when the feeling was that the predecessor of the United Nations, the League of Nations, had not succeeded due to a lack of great power cooperation, and the UN was going to succeed based on whether the veto worked or not. I think what is more important at the moment is to extend the legitimacy of the Security Council. It's very clear that the Security Council today does not reflect 8 decades later the world of 2023. So you have to have, for example, there's no African or Latin American representation on the Security Council. Its legitimacy is threadbare. Many question why Britain and France, which don't appear to be great powers today, are still on the Security Council. So it's important to expand it and bring in other countries, your South Africas, Nigeria, India, Brazil, and try to make it work better, but also try to make it more inclusive and representative. But I don't think you're going to get rid of the veto. So I think we need to work within those constraints.
Yeah, very important themes you touch on there, which has been a constant refrain, from Africans about the need to participate in such an important, at least for now, multilateral organization such as the UN. I just want to quickly check, Prof, we're in a moment where everything that people stand for and the functionality of an organization is tested in a moment of great stress, tension, and myriad demands. The UN Secretary General talking about breaches in humanitarian law. We heard Navi Pillay as well, who's leading the investigative commission, talking about breaches in international law. It's literally being tested, and you have calls in the aftermath of what Guterres said for him to resign. Eli Cohen not wanting to take a planned meeting with him. How do you think this moment is going to be managed, and what does it say for, again, the credibility of the process in this important and deadly moment?
I think it's quite a dangerous situation for the US and its Western allies, because the big elephant in the room that we need to talk about is that Ukraine is a situation where there was clear aggression and a violation of the sovereignty of a member state. And in that case, the US was able to get a condemnation of Russia in the UN General Assembly. Obviously, Russia used its veto in the Security Council, but it did not get the overwhelming numbers that it wanted, and only half of African countries supported that condemnation. And what Israel and Gaza brings up in stark reality is the double standards of the international system. So here you have a situation where Israel has been occupying territory that the UN says must belong to 2 different states. For half a century, you have a defenseless population which is being bombarded. You have an Israeli minister describing them as animals and saying they must be denied food, fuel, basic health supplies, etc. That will make it very difficult for the West to be able to convince the rest of the international community to support international principles in the case of Ukraine. So I think we really are at a very difficult moment where, if we're not careful, the very foundations of the international system and the rules guiding them, we know that this is an intersection of law and politics. So it's not simply about applying international law in a very simple way. Okay. But I think politically, this is going to bring into stark reality the kind of double standards that we see, where Israel is able to get away with things that I think the West is condemning Russia for.